Hi, this is A.R.K. Watson with Catholic Reads, and I'm joined today by Catherine Magia, author of The Fisherman's Bride and A Fisher of Women. Thank you so much for joining me, Catherine.
Thank you for having me, A.R.K. ARK.
um, so this series of books, it's a biblical historical fiction
Yes.
Series told from the point of view of Peter's wife, who was a real historical figure and is kind of mentioned through her mother-in-law in the Bible, but we don't really know much about her other than oral tradition. What inspired you to write these books?
I think it was, it was a soul-searching journey. So I will say that I have always loved to write, but I have never been able to complete a novel or any extended work of prose. And so in many ways, I was searching for an inspiration. At that time, I was going through a significant upheaval in my entire life. And so within a span of 6 months, I had major surgery. I broke up with my fiance at the time, and I got laid off from my job. So I work in the pharmaceutical industry, and I work in, market research and the commercial function. And so at that point, it was just a dramatic, fall. And I was really searching for my identity because we as human beings and functioning members of society define ourselves by what you have and what you do, right? And so, for me, if I was what I did, if I lost my job, did I mean I was nothing? I lost my relationship. I had defined myself by being, with somebody. Did that mean I was nothing? And then at the time I was very young, and so if I lost my health, did that mean I was nothing? And it kind of triggered a journey into defining and finding that deeper identity, the identity where it will never change no matter how rich or poor we are, how successful or not we are, or how healthy we are or not. And I found that identity as being a child of God. And so I went on a retreat. And during that retreat, I spent a lot of time crying. And at the end, I felt completely spent. It was catharsis. And then I listened to the voice inside. And I think that's when I really listened to the voice of God. And I found a comfort and a love and this amazing sense of self-acceptance that I've never experienced before. And in that time period, it was also a silent retreat, so I wasn't able to speak to anybody. In that time period, I also, got this inspiration because on that retreat, there was nothing to read but biblical books, right? In the library of a monastery, it was biblical books and the Bible itself. And so I would take my Bible with me on these silent days, and they had this beautiful stream. It was on the Shenandoah Valley, so I was on a farm, and I took my Bible with me, and I'm praying and I'm crying, and I'm being chased by cows because there were cows pasturing on that farm. And, when I was stopped and hot and sweaty, I flipped open the Bible and I came across a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, and it talked about the healing of Peter's wife and Peter's mother-in-law, rather. And I said, oh, wow, Peter's married. I didn't remember that. Let's see what else is in the Bible about his wife. And I didn't find anything at that point. And I realized that she's only mentioned by inference in the Bible. But if he had a mother-in-law, he had to have had a wife. And then I found later in one of the letters of Paul that she was a partner, and Peter took her with him on his ministry. And those were really the only two endpoints I had for a while until I did a little bit of internet research, and I found that she was a martyr who died before Peter did. And this was documented by Clement of Alexandria. And it was just these three gaps, and the story, her voice, her story kind of spoke to me. And as a writer, that was the first time that really happened where the inspiration came to life itself and wrote its own story. And so it was a long-winded answer, but the answer is that, I was at a spiritual a place of spiritual brokenness, and I was trying to find my way back, and I was at the most difficult point, and so it was also the point of greatest reliance on God. And I remember asking, God, what do you want me to do with my life? And you've given me this gift of writing because I had gone to college on a creative writing scholarship, right? So I have this gift, but what did you want me to do with it? What do you want me to do with my life? And it was in this midst of crying and finding my faith and finding my road back home that this story and this voice and inspiration also came to me. So I really feel like it's a blessing because it wasn't something that I sought. It was definitely a gift and a blessing. And I was chosen to write this tale. It chose me.
Wow, that's quite a story. My goodness. Although we have had a couple of authors get inspired while on monastic retreats. So that's a neat parallel than Catholic authors. So I was wondering, so I feel like anytime someone sits down to write a piece of historical fiction, they have to decide, okay, what am I keeping from history and what am I changing to serve the purposes of the story? And I think that question is a little even more fraught when you're doing events around biblical times, because, there's so many different heresies from historical misunderstandings of early Christianity. And so I wanted to know what you decide, what elements did you find in your research that you weren't planning, like you didn't know about, but you're like, oh, this is really excellent for the story? And what elements did you deliberately change, and why that?
So I think there's a couple of ways to approach that question. One of it is that I was lucky enough to visit the Middle East several times before I started this book. And so I went to Israel and I went to Egypt and Jordan prior to even thinking that I was going to write these books. And so there is a sense there's a very strong sense of time and place and ambiance. And I think that when you're there, you also learn a lot about the oral histories of the traditions and the people that aren't necessarily in the documents. And so for me, the way I approached it was the Bible was my primary source. So my philosophy was to look at what the Bible articulated, that use that as fact, and where there were spaces or gaps or absences, those were the areas that we can imagine, because ultimately my story is a story of faith. And I think that there's so much in the biblical text already, and there's so much beauty in it, but at the same time there's so much that's open to interpretation, right? And so the facts that I kept very constant and very true were the facts that are already biblically documented. And then I did a lot of historical research. I read Plutarch. I read a lot of books on commentary on the traditions of the time. And so so that guided me as well. But every story has a heart and a soul. And so in that sense, I allowed that to guide me. And whatever the facts that I selected or didn't select went through this test of plausibility, where the question was, did it happen or not? The question was, could it have happened? For example, when I was in Israel, I learned that back in the day, women were treated as chattel. I think people know this, but the measure of a woman's worth was based on the number of camels she could command as her bride price. So if she commanded only one camel, she wasn't worth much, and if she commanded 5 camels, she was worth a lot, right? She was worth a great deal. And so some of these ideas, facts, the way that women had to walk like 3 or 6 paces behind their husbands, and they weren't allowed to hold hands in public. They weren't really allowed to be together in public very much, and how that much has inspired into their relationships, this feeling of kind of accepted inferiority, that was all documented. But because my character has a certain story and a certain spirit, I also let that guide me. But a component of my story that is very critical is prayer. So I pray throughout my writing process, and I found that I developed a kind of instinct about what could happen or what could have happened. For example, in A Fisher of Women, there is, an instance of a serpent flying, right? A flying. There's, it comes up only through the antagonist. She's a pagan, she's a sorceress, and so there's a serpent flying. Well, that was based on instinct, but when I researched it, a flying serpent, winged serpent, was actually a documented species that existed at the time. And so it's incredible, but it was documented in all the books on biology. And so it was a very rigorous process where I started off with all the facts of the Bible. Where there were gaps, I invented, and then I went back to the historical text, cultural text, to see if it could have been.
Mm-hmm.
And if it couldn't have been, then that would be something I changed. But it was really the story that was talking to me, the character that was talking to me. For example, there was a reflection in a fisherwoman that involved a butterfly. And it was only 2 paragraphs. But my editor pointed out to me, he's like, butterflies don't fly around at night. And I spent 3 days researching, and I found out that there was a migrant species of butterflies, of the 128 different species of butterflies in the Middle East, that did migrate at dawn or at night. And so, that was based on fact. So I think I'm guided by an intuition that is guided by prayer. And then through that, I go back and I fact check. But I think it's really the spirit of the faith and the spirit of the message that I'm trying to convey, and the character that guides the development of the story.
Yeah, that's cool. I think one of the, if I may spoil a little bit, one of the two of the changes that surprised me, but I kind of like what they do for the literary aspect of the story is so in The Fisherman's Bride, Peter, I find your portrayal of all the apostles very interesting, and I like that Peter's conversion and love for Jesus doesn't immediately make him a saint. He's still a flawed person, especially at the beginning, and he and his wife kind of have a falling out. And I was surprised that you had her end up as the woman that was almost stoned for adultery, because at the time she was abandoned and she was pregnant, so it looked suspicious. And I was also surprised by in Fisher of Women. I think this was the most surprising thing, in that you had, when Jesus healed people, you had him that night afterwards, he would like temporarily take on the illnesses that he had healed them from. So if he'd healed someone of leprosy, he had like leprosy for a few hours or something. And that was really interesting to me. And what made you think of that, or what made you decide to do that?
So, you want me to answer both of them, right? Both the yeah. So in the Fisherman's Bride, the woman who was stoned, I think about the injustices of the world, and particularly the injustices that occur within populations that are more disadvantaged or more marginalized by society. And at that time, they were women. Women didn't have the same rights as men, and if a woman's word and a man's word were to be conflicting, chances are, people would follow the man's word. And I see that, you still see that in society sometimes these days, not all the time, but that still prevails in some societies and some countries. And what I wanted to show there was that, there is a lot more to the eye than we can see, and women suffer untold dignities because of their status, because of what they're capable of doing and what they have the courage to do, and yet they're not really allowed to do it. And so when she became the woman who was stoned, I've always had questions about that story. Like, the woman is carried out, and what we know about her is the judgment. We actually don't know the facts of who that woman was, what her name was, what the actual situation was. If she was raped and then she was afraid to say, and if she was raped and then someone didn't want to take the accountability for the rape and, blamed it on her. And you do see that, a lot of times women are blamed for seducing men when it's the men themselves who have trouble, restraining themselves. And so I want to show, if that situation happened in that time, what was the realistic responses of society? And I think it also shows her in a light where she has courage to follow her husband, to journey alone as a pregnant woman. Women didn't do those in those days, and there's a consequence to be paid. There's a hardship to follow Jesus, but if we're faithful, we're also saved from that. So Jesus comes, and it's to me, that act of forgiveness is also a miracle in itself. It's not a physical healing miracle, but it is a miracle in saving someone's future and someone's life. And he does save her life and the life of the baby by just recognizing the weaknesses in society, and how quickly people jump to judge, and then how quickly people want to kill. Right? They want to condemn, they judge, and then they punish, and then they kill. And it's really, I want to highlight Jesus's departure from that, his departure from the common way of thinking, assuming that people sin, people make mistakes, but she may not have committed that sin, and how he was very different in giving her the benefit of the doubt, but then also really, opening society's eyes to the weaknesses within ourselves and showing us a better path, and to make it real and to make it personal. And that was why I brought her into that. And because that woman is also unnamed, it's plausible it could have been her. It could not have been her, but there's no reason why it can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I mean when I say, like, I met in the spaces. In the second part of the trilogy, A Fisher of Women, the concept of Jesus taking on the physical ailments of those he heals has two sources. In the Bible, Isaiah has a quote, and he says that he takes on our ailments and he bears our infirmities. Right? So that's in Isaiah. And Matthew restates that again. And I think the word ailment and the word infirmities not only refers to sins, but can refer to physical illness. Like an ailment is a physical illness. An infirmity is a physical illness. It's not just a sin. Mm-hmm. And so that was my interpretation of two areas of biblical text. Now, there have been stories about ancient legends of healers, different people, not Jesus. And there's been whisperings that sometimes these people also take on the healing, the illness and the infirmities of the people they healed. And, I think that this is, certainly it's a leap into a little bit of fantasy, right? It's a leap into imagination, but theologically, it makes a lot of sense for me, because everyone knows that Jesus dies, is crucified, and suffers this incredible torture in the last, let's say, 3 weeks of his life, mm-hmm. for us, to save us from sins, right? And so that love is incredibly evident at that point. But the message I want to convey is that if he loves us that much to save everybody in existence and every future person in existence for all the sins that they will commit, how great is that love? And is that love not great enough so that when he heals us, he is both willing and able to take on the pain of cancer, leprosy, blindness, boils, all these terrible, terrible illnesses that he voluntarily takes on just so that one person can be healed. And it brings a different light to his healing, in the sense that it brings his love much more to a reality. For me as an author, even as I write these areas, these passages, viscerally, I experience his love, because I said, there is a cost every time. He hurts every time. Every time he heals, he takes on their pain. He takes on their suffering. He takes on their physical symptoms. He becomes the bleeding, the salivating, the leper. He becomes all these things, but gladly and willingly, he still does it. And that's the price of a miracle. And that's how much he loves us. Can you imagine this incredible love where you love someone so much you will deal with cancer for them. You will experience cancer for them. You'll experience blindness for them. And so I think that even though it is my imagination, there's enough of an inference in the Bible that I interpret it and I feel it's faithful because no one has ever really said what that means. I'm interpreting it in a medical sense. And theologically, the message is still about his love, but it reveals his love in a very eye-opening way, in a very physical way. And that really was how I imagined it, that there's a cost to miracles. And he gladly experiences that cost. And the other thing is, I think as disciples in the world today, we all think that we try to follow Jesus and to try to proclaim the message and try to love the way he does. But there's a huge gap between the way he loves and the way we love, because as much as we want to, we don't love enough to take on physical symptoms for people around us, and even those we love. We try, but we're not there. And the disciples were able to create miracles. Jesus was able to create miracles. We're disciples too. How come we don't do those things? And I would say, our love is in progress. We're working towards it, but we're not there. And so that's really the context of this idea of Jesus taking on the ailments. And the other thing is also that I work in the medical field. So I work in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically in oncology. And I've worked in mental health before. And so the scientific and the medical part of my book is also very accurate. And it's been vetted by multiple doctors. And I've studied a lot of text to be able to bring that kind of medical accuracy into the story.
Oh, that's cool. I think that definitely comes across too. I mean, reading your books felt like a little bit of a Lectio Divina experience for me. I could definitely tell that, there was a lot of prayer involved in writing it. I had wondered about the medical aspect of your book. Mary Magdalene in particular, I know in the you have her as someone who Jesus cured of demons, and I don't remember if that was a historical fact or not. But the way she described her possession, it sounded more like schizophrenia or like extreme bipolar.
Exactly.
Was that your intention?
That was my intention. So it's really interesting about Mary Magdalene because nowhere in the Bible does it say she was a prostitute or anything like that, right? I think that was, later, men's interpretation.
Yeah.
But what we know about her was that she was, so the biblical text says that 7 demons had come out of her. So Jesus cured her of 7 demons. And we also know that she was an independently wealthy woman. She, along with Susanna and Joanna, were the women who financed Jesus's ministry and financed his tours across the country. Mm-hmm. And so, but I thought this idea of 7 demons was, very interesting because, back then there are a lot of things that people couldn't explain. And so they called it, demons and supernatural. But if we were to look about possession and demons in our time and age, what would we call it? We would call it mental illness. And schizophrenia is, a state of mind, a chemical state of mind where, you do see other personalities, you do see other ideas, other parts of yourself or other people can take possession of you and lead you to do strange things. And I think that's documented as, some of the episodes of schizophrenia. And so I really explored the idea of mental illness and really realizing that it was a prevalent condition then as well as now, because it wasn't so simple as, demons. It could be, but I chose to think of it as, we don't believe in demons these days, right? Most of us don't. We believe in science, we believe in the medical truth, and, it could have been demons, but what if she was mentally ill? If that's something that we could all relate to. Mm-hmm. And one of my objectives was to bring this close to home, to bring these people and these characters to a place where we can understand them, we can root for them, we can love them. And Mary Magdalene is very flawed in the sense that, she has this past, But because she was wealthy and she, didn't have any restrictions, and but then she was stricken with this illness, and she did very questionable things to make the pain go away. And I think that when people are stricken by mental illness, they will steal, they will hurt people, they will do violent things, and it's not that they want to, but it's because their illness compels them, and they have to do something to take the pain away. And so, Mary Magdalene, she goes on rampages, she destroys houses, her own house, she sleeps with a lot of guys, she sleeps with women. And, these are not behaviors that we admire, but these are human frailties. These are weaknesses that, she was subject to, um, because of mental illness. We're all subject to if we have that mental illness. And I really wanted to bring that to the forefront, but also really think about, she follows Jesus and she is healed. But that healing and that following is a day by day commitment. And she talks about this. She says, I had this ailment, and then I did these things to relieve myself of this ailment. And after I'm here with Jesus, I still have temptations. We have temptations all the time, every day. And sainthood is not about, I choose to follow Jesus and all is good, right? It's a day by day choice. It's a day by day struggle, and it can be very hard. And, if you are an alcoholic and now you're, not drinking, the alcohol is a temptation. You choose every day to not go back there. She chooses to sin or not to sin every day after she's met Jesus, but it's still hard for her. And I want to convey that sainthood is not an easy thing, right? It's not, you're knighted and then you're done. It's a day by day choice. And so the character of Mary Magdalene was to bring that up, but also to show that, because you're an independently wealthy woman and you've made choices and you've made mistakes, that history does look upon you badly. I mean, for many years, the Pope thought she was a prostitute, and he said so, right? And I think that was where it originally began. One of the early popes in the first or second century, or maybe 14th century, thought she was a woman who was sinning, and then said it was Mary Magdalene. But that was, again, groundless. It could have been, and it could not have been. But the fact that everybody picked up on it so quickly, the men interpreting the Bible said, of course, she was the prostitute because she was not married, and she's wealthy. What else could she do? So I thought it was really interesting to bring up some of those prejudices as well, but also make her real and make the ailments real. It's not some out there demonic possession. It's something that we as a society and many people struggle with every day: mental illness and temptation.
Yeah. I actually read a couple of books by Father Gabriel Morth, who was he died recently, but he was the Vatican's head exorcist, and he has some sections where he talks about he had patients who had both mental illness and problems with demons, and he would work with their therapist, and he'd usually try to get actually a therapist or psychologist that was not religious, so that there was that extra kind of devil's advocate critique in there. It was interesting.
Yeah, I think the subject of demons is very interesting because in many ways it's a subjective term, right? How do you define a demon? Because you have people who say, oh yeah, I have my demon, I deal with my demons. So in that way, demons mean it's your own negative tendency, right? And then you have kind of from a theological perspective, demonic possession, which is something that's very different. And there's so many definitions in between that I think that it's a really interesting debate. How do you define a demon? How do they exist?
Language. Language is funny, isn't it? But you, on the subject of historical, what historical facts you kept and changed. So your villain in Fisher of Women, Helen,
Yep.
She's a Phoenician woman. She's a traitor. She kind of got this fortune teller vibe thing. Was she a creation of yours?
Partly. So like Peter's wife, who was marginally mentioned in history, but not fully defined, she was also one of those people who are marginally mentioned. I don't know if you're familiar with the Acts of the Apostles, and there's a character called Simon Magus.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Simon's the one who says, "Oh, you guys, like, can I buy this Holy Spirit from you? Like, can I have it?" Right? And Peter
Yeah.
yelled at him, and he's known in the empire as being a very powerful magician. Well, Simon the magician had a consort, a woman of dubious origin by the name of Helen.
Hmm.
So nobody knew anything about her besides the fact that her name was Helen, and she was a consort of Simon the magician. But, you know, and arguably, she followed him and wasn't a magician, or arguably, she was a more practiced, more seasoned magician who taught him.
Hmm.
Right? And so I interpret her as, you know, because no one knew anything about her, why couldn't she have been a magician? Because in many ways, the dark arts were associated with women, I would say even more than men in those ancient times.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that she had this dubious origin could also mean that she had to find a way to survive herself. And you know, interestingly enough, Simon the magician and Helen moved on to Rome, where they were revered as pagan magician in Nero's court.
Yeah.
And so, you know, historically, you know, he's documented fairly well. She's less documented, but we do believe that there is a, I believe behind every great man, there's a great woman. And so that is a theme that I take throughout the book, where these women who are seemingly, uh, you know, on the periphery were really at the center of everything. And in many ways, they were as formidable as their husbands, formidable as their partners. And Helen the magician, in my story, actually taught Simon the magician, Simon Magus.
Hmm.
And, you know, he was her pupil, but because he was a man, his fame out, outran hers. But you know, but that was the inspiration, and I wanted to also bring about a counterpart to the paganism and the sorcery at the time, because you don't really run into a lot of books that focus on pagan sorcery and faith and medicine actually at the same time in the same story. But if you really think about someone's healing journey, if you were sick at that time, your first stop would be to the village healer. And they didn't know very much. They'd slap dung and leeches on you and give you some herbs. And if that didn't work, they tell you you were a sinner and there's nothing they could do. And then if you're really desperate, what else did you do? Well, you seek out these alien healers from other empires. And they were sorcerers, and some of them had legitimate medical knowledge. Some of them had very strong herbal knowledge. Some of them can use hypnotherapy. You know, hypnosis is also seen in my book. And these are some legitimate medical healing remedies, but they, you know, they were a step above the the village healers. And of course, but that wasn't foolproof. And so if that failed for you, where else did you go? You're just this desperate sick person.
Hmm.
In that state, you're not really going to Jesus out of believing in him. You are going out of there, out of this blind faith, this blind necessity that you're hurting so much. And out there has to be someone who cares enough and someone who can do something. There just has to be, right? So that's that last shred of hope and faith. And that's where a lot of these people came to Jesus. And through their healing, they were transformed and they were brought back to society. Because again, being sick in those days wasn't just, you know, I'm sick, I'm in bed. You were seen as a sinner and you were taken out of the fiber of society, and no one wanted to have anything to do with you. You would lose your job, you would lose your family, you would lose, you know, your surroundings, you would lose your home, you would lose everything. And that's how people dealt with being sick, because you were now unclean and a sinner. And so I really wanted to bring Helen in to really round out the context of what the world was really like in terms of, you know, there's faith and there's Jesus, but there's also this strong vein of paganism. And, you know, there is a renewed interest in paganism and witchcraft in modern day society, right? And so that time and this time is not so different from us. And there's also people who seek to explain everything through science, like those medical guys, like Hippocrates at the time. So the world isn't so different, and the way we behave isn't so different. What's different is that we now carry, you know, the seed of love and justice within us, and we can't make ourselves blind to it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea she was a real figure. Um, and speaking of like your treatment of real figures, I think I was really challenged by this book. And especially in my ideas of sainthood and perfection. I actually read this because Esley Hall was reading your books, and she was like, "Wait, I don't know about this. Can you read it too? And we'll have a second opinion." So we both read it. I remember there was this one scene where you have Mary show up, and you have that scene where Jesus from the Bible says, you know, they come to him like, your family wants to speak to you, your mother's here, and he's like, my family are people that do my word. And that's something that a lot of people have been confused about, because it sounds a little cold to say to your mom, especially a mom who's immaculate. And I was really struggling with it, and I was talking with my husband, who was like, essentially, I think in your story you had that she hadn't spoken up in defense of her son in some social situation, and he was disappointed at her in that. And that really bothered me at first, because I was like, wait, this is Mary. She's supposed to be perfect. And I was talking to my husband, he was like, just because somebody's perfect doesn't mean that they read every situation perfectly, and that they do just because someone's sinless doesn't mean that they do the absolutely perfect thing in every situation, because it's easy to misunderstand and to just like, yeah. So that was kind of eye-opening for me. And it really kind of made me, it made her actually more relatable.
Yeah, so for me, so the trigger for that was the fact that I also interpret when she comes to see Jesus, she's journeyed all this way, and he's like, nope, my family's over here. I also interpret that as a rejection, and like your husband, I also saw the difference between being sinless and being perfect. And so, I think if you think about how difficult it is to raise children. Even Jesus, who is perfect, and Mary, who is sinless, is bound to have conflict, because Mary is still human, right? And I think about the way my friends raise their kids, or in a different situation. Jesus is extraordinary. He's a child prodigy, right? And Mary, sinless as she is a commonly educated village woman, right? She doesn't have any great learning, and she may not be able to relate to him. And so it made me think about mother and child relationships, and how there's a lot of conflicts, and no one has a perfect relationship. There's conflict, there's misunderstanding, there's anger, there's disappointment. Doesn't mean either of them sinned, but it meant that they weren't in the same place. They weren't developing the same way. Jesus is this one with this great mission to save humanity, and Mary could very well be, I love my son and I don't want him to die because I have to watch my son die. And she's not sinning because she feels fear and pain, and anxiety because her son may die, right? And so it brings a very realistic human perspective on her. But I really thought that, given that she was an ordinary woman, besides the fact that she's sinless, and he is extraordinary, they had to have conflict. Mm-hmm. And the way that I thought about it is just that the passages in the Bible that keep saying Jesus as a prophet is accepted everywhere except in his hometown, right? Why is he not accepted in his hometown? And I said, well, because everybody watched him grow up. Everybody saw how in many ways he was, did what all the other kids did, maybe a little bit smarter, maybe a little bit quicker, but he did the same thing, so nobody believed him. And I think in the sea of unbelief, particularly before, and I think of Jesus as a developing person, right? So as a teenager and an adolescent, he's probably a little bit different than the Jesus of 30 to 33-year-old that we see, right? Mm-hmm. And in that time, if he wants to proclaim himself, but people are not ready to listen, he's got to be sad. He's got to be angry. He's got to be frustrated. And he's asking his mom, why are you not proclaiming with me? And she's like, I don't know how to do that. I'm a simple woman. I can say yes to God, but I have not been called to speak on a public forum as a woman to the teachers and say, you're the Messiah. I don't know how to do that. It's part of my growing process to have courage, to learn to speak up, and to support you in that way. But, at this point in time, I don't know how to do it. I can't. There nobody's going to listen to me, and she's afraid. And so in my mind, like, the conflict between them is very real because they're still human. And people cannot be sinning and not necessarily even be making mistakes. But if they're in different places at the same time, there's going to be conflict.
Hmm.
Another story which you'll find interesting is when I visited Turkey, I went to the caves of the first century Christians. And there was a mural there that had Mary in the temple drinking holy water. And I looked at my tour guide and I said, "What is that? Like, I've never heard of Mary drinking holy water. What is that about?" And he says, "We believe in this region, the early Christians in Cappadocia, in modern day Turkey, believe that Joseph didn't trust Mary. So when she goes to him and she says, 'I'm pregnant,' and it's not with your kid, obviously, uh, he didn't say happily, 'Okay, the angel told me, I'm just going to take you in. No big deal.'" Right? He brought her to the temple and had her tested. So the test was if you were able to drink holy water, you passed the test and you were therefore telling the truth.
Hmm.
If you could not drink it, that meant you were lying. And if she was lying, he was probably going to subject her to all the punishments at the time, which is to be, stoned or whatever it was, stoned or quartered or drawn, whatever it was. And so in that way, it made me see that Joseph himself was also flawed. He was not sinless. He doubted her. He was angry with her. He was frustrated with her. He probably wasn't very happy when Jesus was born because he loved her as a man, selfishly as well. And so you think about the dynamics that could have happened with imperfect people. And what it really means to be a saint is that not that you don't have flaws, but that for the sake of Jesus, you work very hard to overcome them for your love, for your mission, for Jesus. You work hard to overcome these flaws. And that's kind of what the premise that I built for these characters, and Mary in particular. And I'm setting it up also that there's a reconciliation that happens in book 3. Right. So Peter and Jesus and his mother are not on good terms right now. They're kind of remote. She follows him. She wants to help. He's not really sure if he wants her there. He's still angry with her.
Mm-hmm.
But all that will change in book 3 before he dies.
Okay, that's good. I'll look forward to that. I was also really interested in how you portrayed Peter and Judas. This is possibly my favorite portrayal of Judas. I think people have tried to make Judas sympathetic and tragic before, but this guy really felt relatable, and particularly in how like oddly compassionate he was. Like I love that moment where the fisherman, like you never name her, which I really like that literary device. But Peter's wife is her daughter's like crying and upset, and Judas knows what to do to calm her down, and she asks him how, and he says, we all had families once. Like just that little moment there was like, that was pretty sweet.
Yeah, so with both Peter and Judas, I sought to kind of make them also relatable. One of the things I really, book 3 will really delve into Judas's backstory,
Mm-hmm.
as well as why he betrayed Jesus. But I think that the books that I've read, I was never satisfied with people's portrayal of Judas. I think there was a story that, they said that Jesus told him to betray Judas, so therefore Jesus made Judas the villain because he was only obeying Jesus, right? And I didn't like that because I felt like, that was contrary to what we believe and what Jesus would do. But I wanted to convey Judas as very much a military man, right? Because in that time, in that revolutionary aspect, some of Jesus's followers were genuinely zealots. They were revolutionaries, so they wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire that ravaged their land and raped their women and stole from them and taxed them and did all these horrible things to them. And so I think Jesus's followers fell into a couple different camps. There were people who were, who really understood his message of love and compassion early on. It was the women and the sick because they were marginalized. And there were these like men who were not extraordinary, but they felt really flattered that Jesus called them, and they wanted to kind of make their fortune with Jesus. I mean, initially they wanted to be part of something greater than themselves. That's why they followed him. I don't think they quite understood what he meant until the end. And they were all equally shocked by his death because they expected a victor. They didn't expect, this person who died. It's like this loser. Who's this loser who died, right? You're not supposed to die. You're supposed to bring us to these areas of great heights. And I think that central to that is both the stories of Judas and Peter. And so Judas is a military man. And so whatever he does, he devotes himself completely. And you can see that he's usually the most alert.
Yeah.
And
you had him like actively standing guard over Jesus at night. That was really sweet.
Yeah, so he's the warrior, and for those that he loves Jesus, and he's falling in love with the protagonist as well. He cares intensely, and he loves in a very deep and profound way. And I intentionally showed this because I wanted to show that even if you love in this very intense and profound way, you still have weaknesses. And the weakness is if you don't love Jesus as the extreme, if you don't love Jesus more than anything else, you may end up betraying him, right? Because, and I think with Judas, he loved Jesus. But, as the protagonist starts to point out in the book, there's one thing that means the world to him, and that's the revolution.
Yeah,
and in his mind right now, Jesus and the revolution are one. Right? Jesus means that there's going to be a revolution. The Romans are going to be out. What's going to happen when he figures out that it's not going to be the case? He's got to choose.
Yeah. He's going to have to choose his nation or his prophet.
Or his prophet. Or his friend, this brother that he loves. And so really kind of thinking of Judas as someone who, in many ways, if you think about the Nazis, I will take Hitler out of the equation because I think he's a different animal. But if you think about many of the followers of Germany at that time, I think that they thought they were doing what's best for their country. And they thought that they were just following orders. And it could, these men could come home and be very sweet and tender people to their wives and their families and have wonderful friends. But they played a role in this horrible, horrible thing because they believed that, they believed in this nationalism of Germany. And they had to do everything to make this happen. And I think that when you believe in something to an extreme, and that something is not God, it's problematic. Yeah. And so that's really the psychology behind Judas.
I liked your portrayal of Peter as well. I like that he's so unsure of himself. There was a passage where he was talking about, I don't understand why Jesus calls me the rock and names me the leader, because there's other men here that are intelligent and learned, and there's experienced soldiers, and I'm a nobody hill country bumpkin. And I liked, I don't know, I like that lack of self-confidence in him. And also, it was off-putting at first, but I like that lack of self-confidence kind of ends up hurting his wife, and that he feels like if he relies on her, or if the other men see how smart she is and how much he needs her, that it'll make him appear weak.
Yeah, I thought Peter was, by far the hardest character for me to write. I struggled with the characterization of Peter a lot. And I think because, he's flawed and I want to redeem him, but he still has to be a sympathetic character throughout. But I think the way that I've portrayed him is that if you read in the Gospels, I think of him as a very retractable character. And I mean retractable in the sense that when something happens, he's always the first to volunteer. Me, Jesus, call on me. But then, he'll back off. He'll be like, oh, wait, never mind. Or he's also the first one that Jesus reprimands, right? Yeah. Or he's like, oh no. He's like, Jesus says, I'm going to die. He's like, no, Jesus, you're wrong. And Jesus is like, no, get behind me, Satan, right? So you think of Jesus as Peter as this very eager to please but insecure person. But he's got the speed, the wit, and the intelligence, but not the confidence to stand his ground. And so so if you look at his character throughout the Bible, that's what he's like. He's smart, he's sweet, but he's like, me first. Oh wait, never mind. Okay. And his, his,
Yeah, he's very much make me a saint, but not yet, not yet.
and his betrayal of Jesus was prominent, right? I mean, everybody else ran away, right? Everybody ran away aside from John, but he was the one who was just like, he shows up because he wants to go back in there to be with Jesus. So he gets points for showing up, but then he gets more points deducted than everybody else because he's like, oh, I don't know that man. I don't know that man. I don't know that man. Yeah. And so I think just trying to convey what it's like to live with this very unpredictable character. And in The Fisherman's Bride, you'll see that before Jesus is part of the picture, he's not insecure with his wife. He loves her. He rescues her from an arranged marriage where she was going to be unhappy. They're kind of like hand-in-hand partners, although he's a little bit more of the theorist. He's like, I have these ideas. And his partners are more like, okay, how's it going to work? But there isn't any insecurity with him towards his wife because he felt like she was in her place. He was in his place and things were good, but he had this restlessness. He knew he was capable of more. He felt he was destined for more. He didn't know what to do with it. And then that becomes more prominent when their first child dies. So they have a stillborn baby and their child dies and she completely loses it. She goes through a period of difficult mental state and he's trying to support her. And so she doesn't realize what he's gone through and the healing that he needs until she's healed. So in the first book, they meet Jesus. And the reason Peter initially connects with Jesus is that Jesus understands pain and suffering and is able to give it meaning in a way no one else has done for him. And so he's like, wow, I understand why I had to suffer, why I lost my son. Because in those days, having a son is really important. It's a man's pride to have, a male heir that carries on the bloodline. And so Peter is very much trying to, reestablish himself. And so his insecurity begins when he loses his son and his wife loses her mind for a while. And then when Jesus becomes part of the picture, he doesn't know how to deal with the situation. And, he leaves his wife because he can't explain to her why he needs to leave, but he can't tell her he's going to leave either. And he doesn't even know where he is. And so being thrust in an unfamiliar situation where there's greatness there, but you don't even know how to wrap your mind around it, makes him extremely insecure. And so he vents that on her because it's safe, right? It's not safe to vent it out on Jesus or the other guys. God forbid they look down on him. So he starts to vent his insecurity on her. And that makes him a very unlikable character. The other thing that I realized by reading the letters of Paul is that Peter, in his natural tendency, he gets better, but in his natural tendency is kind of prejudiced. Because there's a passage in one of Paul's letters where Peter's ministering to the Gentiles. The Jews show up, and then Peter goes and plays with the Jews. And Paul's like, Peter, you can't do that. You're ministering with the Gentiles. You need to everybody's equal. You can't go play with your favorites. Yeah. So if he has those tendencies, those human flaws, that also meant that in the beginning, he was all fine when he was seen as superior to her. If that changes, he had a problem with it. He had a problem with Matthew, the intellectual. He had a problem with Mary Magdalene, an intellectual woman. He had a problem with Judas, who was from Judea and not a Galilean. He has problems with all these people that he himself has problems with. Helen has to work out in his own mind. And it's a major growing for Peter, but all his flaws are still there. And I feel like, he really loves his wife. And so he wants to protect her. He wants to be the big man who can, fix everything. And I think he's super frustrated that he can't. And the situations that arise, her healing, what Judas is able to do, what James is able to do, and how he's physically much weaker than they are, and Jesus's favor, and because they're all competing for Jesus's favor too. They all want to sit on his right or left side, right? Mm-hmm. And so, all these dynamics have got him very edgy, and so it's in this state of edginess and insecurity where he's trying to develop his faith and trying to maintain his relationship with his wife, but his flaws come through. And I'm also setting him up for his redemption because you think of him as being insecure. And I think the transition that Peter really makes is that he's been intractable his entire life. He sticks his head out there and then he sticks it right back in. And after Jesus is resurrected, Peter finally learns that for faith, for God, for his love, and for Jesus, he's going to stick his out there and keep it out there. But, you know, the whole journey is this retractability. And so that's what I've tried to convey. But, you know, I didn't like him as I was writing him very much. And so that comes through. And then I tried to like him, and I tried to kind of change him a little bit to make him more likable. But I think that in the treatment as his wife, I still question why she's invisible. I think that there's a little bit of Peter ego and the men's ego, where if a woman has the courage to die for her faith before her husband, who happens to be the first pope, that means that she has to be extraordinary. And it has to mean that she was a leader in many ways. And because she died for her faith before he did, she was a leader before he was.
Yeah.
In that sense.
He brought her along on his ministry, so eventually he probably does recognize and rely on her. But
And I think he was comfortable with that, but I don't think the men around him were fully comfortable with how much of a leader she was.
yeah.
And that's why she was invisible. And they're still not comfortable with how much of a leader the women were. Mary Magdalene, the other women. They became leaders, but nobody wants to talk about them. Right?
Yeah, I like too that, you know, you have this theme of women's roles in the church and women's leadership, but it's never like, it's not that like, oh, that the men aren't needed, or that, you know, a woman should have been an apostle or anything like that. It's like because it's like as the men characters learn to trust and respect the women more, that actually makes them better at their roles. It's just a neat dynamic.
Yeah, and I really, the way that I think about it is that we are all called to, you know, I think that society these days, it's very important to many people, whether or not you're a feminist, right? How important the role of women is, how important the role of different races are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all important and legitimate. But my perspective is that the mission and the message of love supersedes that.
Mm-hmm.
That your role could be a very public role, and you're called to be a leader and a pope and an archbishop or a priest. And your role is to be named and be someone who spreads the love. Or your role could be a small role or an invisible role. And the fact is, some of us are called to those invisible roles, to love in a way that is not about us, that's about God. And we have to accept that. The fact that she's invisible and she's not named is very deliberate. First of all, I didn't want to make anything up. There's really no document of what her name is. There's hearsay that her name is Perpetua, but that's a Roman name. So I didn't use that because she's a Jewish woman. She wouldn't have the name Perpetua.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to make up and say she's Miriam or she's Esther or she's somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to be as historically accurate as possible. But, you know, the message of God is the message of invisibility. When we love someone so much, when we love God so much, our community so much, that person becomes more important than we are. Suddenly, our identity, our gender, our jobs, and you know, the us part of it, the ego part of it is not as important because love supersedes that. And so, you know, there is a prominent aspect of being true to women's roles. And, you know, women are incredible and they have been as incredible then as they are incredible now. We just never saw it then. And I wanted to pay homage to that. But more importantly, you know, I wanted to pay homage to the fact that women's roles are important, but the message of love is even more important. And the fact is, if we are truly to grow in love, we have to allow ourselves to be invisible, right? To love and not take credit for it, to do good things and not take credit for it. And when you love your child or your spouse or a friend to the way that Jesus loves, it's not about you. You don't think about you. Whether it's, you know, you take on their suffering because you don't want them to suffer, so you're going to take it on. Or, you know, you want all the attention, all the resources, all the energy focused on them. It's about them because you love them. That's truly what love is, when it is selfless and invisible.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really insightful. Wow. So I'm curious, as you were writing these books, you mentioned that you're in the medical industry. How did you find time to write these two novels?
It's tricky. I'll say that it's you know, an ongoing process, and The first book I actually started writing when I was on sabbatical. So, that was the break between my job and my life. But it took me 7 years to write that first book. And it was it was a combination of all three books, actually. And so, but it was never edited. And then after 7 years, I found a very prestigious agent. She was the agent for the Red Tent. So I was working with her, but I was new to the industry and I didn't know how to edit my book. And for whatever reason, my book wasn't picked up by the publishing houses. And so then I spent a lot of time crying because I didn't know what to do with it. And plus I was working again. So I wasn't working for about a year, but I continued to write while I was working. And then I found a self-published author who had a lot of insight. And so she said, you can just publish it and I'll help you edit it.
Mhm.
So, and it was at her suggestion that I broke it through 3 parts.
Mhm.
To make it a trilogy. And at first it was going to be 2 books, right? Because I had so much story, I couldn't finish it in 1 book. So I broke it off and I wrote the first book and then I rewrote the second. And then, now I'm starting the third. But it was through her guidance. And so I write when I'm inspired. I will say that with the third book, I'm having a little bit of trouble writing the story, not because I don't know the story. The story's in my head, but I can't connect with the character and with her voice yet. Like I can only write in a very natural and organic way if I feel like the characters' voices are in my head and they're talking to me.
Mhm.
That's how the first story came to life, and that's how I continue to write the second book. If I don't feel that closeness to the character, then maybe it's time for more prayer or it's time to do something else and recharge. So I find that when I write just, mechanically, it doesn't work for me. Like I try to write mornings or weekends, not always. I go through periods where for 6 months, I would write every day from 7 p.m. until like midnight, and it'd be so productive. And then I'd go through months where I'm not writing anything. And even when I start, I write and I'm not feeling it. And so it really varies. But I think having the goal of writing and finishing the book and then wanting to publish it helps because it helps you kind of cross that line of something that you're working on to something that is really complete and out there. And I do have some friends who have really helped me with the editing. So the network is really important.
Mhm. So you're working like a 40-hour job and then
Yeah, it's probably, it varies. It can be 40 to 60, but it's also a lot of traveling. So I travel between 30 to 40% of the time, depending on the day of the week. So that makes it very, very challenging. But you just prioritize what you love. My lifestyle is such that I only have my job and time for writing and time for church and volunteering. But I don't really have other things in my life that take up my time. I know like my friends have kids, kids take up a lot of time, or a lot of people have commitments and hobbies, other hobbies that takes up a lot of time. I have prioritized writing, so I'm able to continue, but I honestly don't write at the speed I want to. But I've also realized for me that I might not be able to do it even if I wasn't working, because to be honest with you, the year that I was off and kind of struggling to put my life back together, I didn't write that much more than I did in the years where I was inspired and working full time. So I think having a balance helps inspire, right brain, like having a right brain job helps inspire the left brain, right? Or however that works. I'm not even sure.
Give one side of the brain a rest and work on the other side.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it is, but I think all writers struggle with that, right? Just consistently practicing your art and honing your craft. And I'm in a place where I haven't been as good about it, but hopefully that'll turn around soon.
Awesome. Awesome. So you're working on the sequel, right? So this is gonna cover what, like, because you end kind of during the second book ends kind of during Jesus's ministry. So this is are you gonna take this all the way to her martyrdom?
Yes.
Or, wow.
Yeah. So it's going to be, it's going to take, the first book will really start with the ministry. But Jesus's ministry gets really serious once John the Baptist dies, right? When people are like, oh my gosh, someone is dying now, and all the disciples are depressed, right? So you kind of start with that kind of seriousness of the dangers of Jesus's ministry, and then his crucifixion and resurrection, right? And all the events that happen, right? So, it's Judas's betrayal, it's Peter's betrayal, all the things that happen to his resurrection and then to her martyrdom. So I haven't figured out, how long it's going to be. And then, there's a little bit, and I'm trying to figure out how big the daughter's role is, right? Because there's a little bit about the daughter. She's just born. She's a toddler. I have trouble writing kids because I don't have any. But I'm working out some details, but it'll cover that general time period, and it'll cover really the transition of the Roman Empire's treatment to the Jews, because Jesus's death and crucifixion and all the riots that happened, and like this whole Barabbas thing, Pontius Pilate was very much looked upon poorly by the Roman Empire for failing to keep the Jews in order.
Yeah, then you have the whole fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's
right. Right. Exactly. And so so there's this kind of political infrastructure that is falling and breaking and changing. And so Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection is part of that, and her martyrdom is part of this big context of how the world is changing, and how Jerusalem, like after this point, the Jews are no longer free after the fall of Jerusalem in the 70 AD, right? They're now shipped as slaves across the empire because they keep rebelling. And so, and what are all the revolutionary elements, and what are the zealotry elements, like all the guys who followed Jesus and wanted a revolution? That's still happening. And it's really interesting because, when Jesus is on the donkey and everybody's, walking to Jerusalem, and everybody has these palm fronds, Palm Sunday. Mm-hmm. So most of us don't know this, but it's a political act. So the palms are symbolic of Simon of the Maccabees. Simon the Maccabees is a Jewish leader who threw the Greeks out 2 centuries ago. And Simon the Maccabees, his symbol was the palms. So the fact that Jesus is on his donkey tottering down Jerusalem with all his disciples in tow and everybody throwing palms at him is not ornamental. Everybody has an expectation. Right? And when he doesn't meet that expectation, things fall apart in their minds. So, it's very interesting to see how things, move forward.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. I'm really looking forward to that. Do you have an idea of when that might come out, or no idea yet? Or do you have like a website that people can follow to see when it comes out?
So I had planned to start writing it, but I haven't actually written it. Once I start writing, so the first book took me 7 years, right, to write and edit. The second book took me 2 years to write and to edit.
Okay.
So I wrote the second book. The writing itself was probably about a year and a half, 16 to 18 months.
Yeah.
So I would think that, and that was really fast. So the third book, I would think that it's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
So it probably won't take like a decade, 7 or 9 years, but I don't know if it's going to be quite as fast. Because I want to feel it, and I'm not feeling it right now. And I'm also wondering if I need to, I need to work on something else. So I have some other ideas, but part of it is also, I'm trying to see how much people love the second book. Like if they really love it, then I'm much more, encouraged to write the third book. If it's, not, people are less excited about it than the first book, then maybe I'll work on something else. So a lot of it has to do with kind of, demand. Like if people are asking
for the business.
Yeah, if people are asking for it, then I'll do it right away. And I've had, I've had a few people reach out to me, but I'm still trying to figure out if, I'm in the place to write it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Do you have a website or somewhere that your readers can follow you?
Yeah, so I have it's www.catherinemagia.com. And, I used to post my events. So I used to do a lot of reading events. and I teach in schools, just helping kids in Catholic schools write. And I'm volunteering at centers to do workshops for writers, like shelters and things like that. Uh, so I have a website. I don't post very often recently, so I have to be better at that. One of the things that I'm really happy that you're helping me with is the fact that I don't have much of an online presence, and I think some of that has to do with preference. It's not natural for me. I like to write, I like to talk about my books, but I'm not as comfortable getting out there digitally as a lot of people are. So thank you for helping me on that front. But yes, I have a website and have to be better about posting anywhere I should. So I look to you to guidance to really help me with how do I do that. But I want to ask you, because I do worry when people read my second book, if their conclusion is they are turned off, or if their faith is affirmed in a different way, in a way they didn't think about, but if it affirmed their beliefs about our faith.
I mean, like I said, I think your book's very challenging, and I think that's a good thing. A good book is going to leave some people uncomfortable. Some people might misinterpret, I think, your intentions. They might think you're taking the feminist angle too far, or they might think that some of the the changes you made to serve the purpose of the story that you're advocating that actually historically happened. I don't think that's the case. I think that a lot of readers will also discern that, no, like, it's historical fiction. You have to tell a story.
Right.
But it's one of those things that you're never going to please everybody. And honestly, if your work is really good, you're gonna piss some people off. Like, there's a reason why a lot of the classics have been banned by libraries at some point or other. And I really enjoyed it, and it really made me kind of reflect on my concept of holiness and perfection and my own journey to sainthood, and it kind of made it more real and achievable, I think. Seeing these people that I know become saints struggle with the same things that I do, and sometimes struggle with them harder. So yeah, no, I found it really edifying.
I'm glad, because I do find that the way that we're raised in our tradition, just because of our reverence for the saints, it makes them seem so far from us, right, and so different. And I really don't believe that they were that different in the beginning. I think where we fall, we're not where works in progress is the fact that how far are we willing to to work and to do what they did? Like, are we going to put our necks out in the end and not retract like Peter? Because I think most of us are like the Peter in the beginning, right? We feel it, we want to help, and we'll stick our necks out there. But at some point, we're like, I've had enough. This is too much. And you kind of go back into your bubble. And so, and I think that's that's exactly why I wrote him that way. And also, the character of this woman is that she she's also being tempted by Judas. He's falling in love with her, and she's attracted to him. And if she wasn't already married and she, didn't love Peter, maybe she would have gotten together with him. But the fact is, she's made a commitment, and she feels that temptation, and it's a very real temptation, but she overcomes it. And I think that's the other thing, is that I feel like temptation is so real, and we always think that the saints don't have temptation, and they do every day.
Yeah.
But they make the choice.
Yeah, but they're still the same people inside.
They're still the same people inside. And there's a little bit of that insecurity, I think, that comes with us as human beings, that as far as we go, I mean, we're still a little bit insecure, right? And I don't think that'll change, because it's a human condition.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to your sequel, or whatever you end up writing.
Yeah, third book of the trilogy. Yeah, one. But let me know if you get a chance to read the first one too.
Yeah, I need to go back and read the first one.
I gave you a few spoilers, but I don't think that changes the appeal.
Yeah, no, there's I mean, with historical fiction, there's always going to be spoilers. Like there's gonna be things that happen.
Right.
But that's not really why people read historical fiction.
Yeah. And I
They
think
do it for the characters and for the setting, and you do a really good job at that.
thank you. And I think a lot of that comes from the being there in person, but also because spiritually, I've struggled a lot. And I think that, and I've learned some things from my struggle. And I think that's also what I bring to the books, because some of the feedback I've received is that the pain and the suffering and the situation, it's all so real, right? Like, it's very catastrophic and very multidimensional.
Mhm.
And I would say that either it's based on an experience that I had, or it's based on experiences of people that I know who've really struggled. Like mental illness, that's something that I know many people who struggle with it.
Working in the medical industry, I'm sure that's a suffering that you're very close to on a daily basis.
Yeah, and so I think that that's why the healings and the ailments are so visceral,
Mhm.
right? It's very because I experience it, and I've seen it, but also, it was challenging for me to write it. I cried a good part of it because um, it hurt me so much to see these people hurting, and then it hurt me to see Jesus hurting, even as I was writing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, I can tell it's definitely a work of prayer. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And if you guys want to follow Catherine, you can follow her at catherinemagia.com. And keep an eye on Catholic Reads. I'm sure we'll uh, post the next review of her book, whatever it may be. And if you want something else to read right now, or you can't afford a book, don't forget you can subscribe to Catholic Reads and get a weekly book marked down 50% off to free. And find new authors and support this wonderful movement of the Holy Spirit. And if you want to follow what I'm doing, although it's very slow going, my website is arkwatson.com. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Catherine, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, A.R.K. Take care.
Take care.